For topic 5, we're going to look at horizontal and vertical lines. So you have to kind of go all the way back to the very, very beginning of this worksheet. So scroll back all the way to topic, not even topic 1, before topic 1. So at the very beginning of this worksheet, we defined what a linear equation in two variables was. And we learned that a linear equation in two variables is any equation of the form ax plus by equals c. We know that a, b, and c can be any real number, fractions, decimals, positive, negative, whole numbers, any of that, okay? Just as long as a and b are not both 0. And I said, hey, way later, we're going to figure out what happens when a and b, or a, I shouldn't say a and b, what happens when a or b is 0. And we do get a very specific type of line. So scrolling back down to topic, what are we on, topic 5? Okay, so topic 5, we're going to talk about horizontal and vertical lines, okay? So I do have recall, all right? So just as another second reminder, a linear equation in two variables is any equation of the form ax plus by equals c, where a, b, and c are real numbers such that a and b are not both 0. A could be 0, that's fine. B could be 0, that's fine. They just can't be 0 at the same time. What we need to investigate is what happens when A is 0, what happens when B is 0, okay? So let's first look at what happens when B is 0, okay? Well, when B is 0, we get AX. Let me write that a little bit better. There we go. We get AX plus 0y equals c, which means we get ax equals c, which ultimately means we're going to get a equals c over a, which is just some number. So this is just some number. So what ends up happening when b equals 0, the y term disappears, leaving an equation with only an x. Okay, without a y, the equation cannot touch the y-axis. Okay, so in order to cross the y-axis, you have to have a y in the equation that doesn't have a 0 as the coefficient. In order to touch the x-axis, you have to have an x in the equation. Well, if we don't have a y, the graph can't touch the y-axis, but it must touch the x-axis. Okay, so for that to happen, we have to be parallel to the y-axis, which means we're vertical. Okay. So it's kind of a lot to take in without like big time graphs, but I'll show you in just a minute, okay? So again, if b is equal to 0, right here, the coefficient of y, if the coefficient of y is 0, that y term just becomes 0, leaving us with ax equals c. If we were to solve for x, we would divide both sides by a, x equals c over a. This is just a number. All right, because remember, a, b, and c are real numbers. All right, so anytime we get x equals a number, that would indicate a vertical line, because without a y, we cannot touch the y-axis, but with an x, we must touch the x-axis. And the only way that can happen is if our line is parallel to the y-axis, which makes it vertical. Okay, so this right here, I'm going to do it in like pink. Well, let's do purple. This right here is really, really important. Vertical lines are always of the form x equals a, where a is the x-intercept, okay? So kind of keep that in mind. When the y term disappears, meaning b is 0, then we get x equals just some number, which is a vertical line, okay? Now let's erase some of this work so we can see what happens when a is 0, okay? So when a is 0, the coefficient of x, when it's 0, the x term just becomes 0, which leaves us something of the form by equals c. To solve for b, or rather, to solve for y, we would divide both sides by b, and that would give us y equals c over b. And because a, b, and c are real numbers, that's just some number. So we get y equals some number. Well, what happens? Well, when y is some number, okay, that means a had to be 0, okay? When a is 0, the x term disappears, okay? Leaving an equation with only a y, okay? Without an x, the equation cannot touch the x-axis, okay? But it still has to touch the y-axis because it has a y, okay? So if we can't touch the x-axis, we have to be parallel to it, which makes us horizontal, okay? So if a is 0, the x term disappears, leaving an equation with just a y, which means we have to touch the y-axis, but we cannot touch the x-axis. The only way for that to happen is if we're a horizontal line, okay? So let's do this in maybe pink. So what's really important down here is horizontal lines are always of the form y equals b, where b is the y-intercept, okay? So if one of those two real numbers, a or b, is 0, you're either going to get a horizontal or a vertical line. And the way to understand which is think about which variable do I have? That means I have to touch that axis without touching the other one. So if you're left with an equation that just has an x, that means you have to touch the x-axis, but you cannot touch the y-axis, which means you have to be parallel to the y-axis, which makes you vertical. If you're left with just a y, that means you have to touch the y-axis, but you cannot touch the x-axis. The only way for that to happen is if you're horizontal and you're parallel to the x-axis. Okay, so let's graph each equation, state the intercepts. If one does not exist, say so. Okay, so when you have horizontal and vertical lines, you're going to have an equation that very much looks like an equation in two variables, but one of the variables will be missing. So if we look at part A, we have 4x minus 5 equals negative 3. We clearly have an x, we do not have a y. So what we want to do is we want to simplify this equation and solve for whichever variable we do have. So we want to solve for x, okay? So I'm going to do this kind of off to the side a little bit for the sake of room. So I have 4x minus 5 is negative 3. I want to get the 4x alone. The issue is this 5, okay? So I'm going to move the 5 by adding it to both sides. 5 minus 5 or negative 5 plus 5 is just 0. 4x plus 0 is 4x. And then negative 3 plus 5 is 2, all right? And then 4, I need to divide both sides by 4. I need to undo that multiplication of 4 and x. So I divide both sides by 4. 4 divided by 4 is 1. 1 times x is x. And 2 divided by 4 is 1 half. Okay, so we have an equation that has only an x. This means we must cross the x-axis, but cannot cross the y-axis. So we would want to figure out where 1 half is on the x-axis. Remember, this is our x-intercept. So our x-intercept is 1 half. So that would be like right here. And then the only way to have a line that crosses the x-axis, that crosses the x-axis but does not cross the y-axis is if you have a vertical line. Pretend that is perfectly straight. Okay? Alrighty, so the directions said graph each equation. We have done that. State the intercepts. We've stated one of them. If one does not exist, say so. Well, if you are a vertical line and you cannot touch the y-axis, that means you cannot have a y-intercept. So for the y-intercept, I would just put not applicable, and that's it. Okay, so vertical and horizontal lines are really easy to graph, but you have to really understand why you have a vertical line versus why you have a horizontal line. And it all comes down to which variable is missing. When we have both x and y, we're going to touch the x and the y axis somewhere. If one of those is missing, we can't touch that particular axis. Okay, so for part B, we have negative 3y plus 4 equals 1. Okay, we only have a y, we do not have an x, so that means let's go ahead and solve for the y. So I've got negative 3y plus 4 equals 1. I want to isolate the negative 3y. To do that, I need to move this 4. I would do that with subtraction. 4 minus 4 is 0. Negative 3y plus 0 is negative 3y. And then 1 minus 4 is negative 3. Okay? Now, I need to get the y by itself. So I have to undo the multiplication of negative 3 and y. To do that, I divide both sides by that coefficient. Negative 3 divided by negative 3 is 1. 1 times y is y. And then negative 3 divided by negative 3 on the right is 1. So we get the equation y equals 1. This means I have to cross the y-axis at 1. I cannot touch the x-axis. So go ahead and plot your y-intercept. Draw your, let me do it in red so it's really obvious. Draw your horizontal line. And then let's state our intercepts, okay? So the y-intercept, whoops, it took a minute to switch colors there. The y-intercept is 1, The x-intercept does not exist. You could put D N E for does not exist, or just NA for not applicable, or just say none, okay? But with horizontal lines, you're always going to have a y-intercept, no x-intercept. For vertical lines, you're always going to have an x-intercept, but no y-intercept, okay? So that is horizontal and vertical lines. And I think that's the end of this section. So this was a long section, okay? So we've done a ton. Hopefully it makes sense. This is all stuff that in theory you probably should have seen at some point. It may have been a while, or it may have been something you felt like you never really learned, but take your time with these videos, okay? I know they're a little bit long, but please watch them in their entirety.